The laughter started the moment 68-year-old Alan Perry paid $15 for a cracked engine block nobody else even wanted at the Dry Creek Estate auction. Wade Holloway smirked beside the cattle fence. Old man just bought half a ton of scrap iron. People filmed Alan loading it into his rusted pickup, while cold Kansas wind pushed dust across the yard. But Alan never answered them. He only rested one weathered hand against the broken steel, like he already knew something the rest of Dry Creek didn't. And buried inside that engine block was a secret powerful enough to change the entire county. If you've ever watched quiet people get mistaken for broken ones, stay with me. Now let me tell you about Alan Perry, because men in Dry Creek, Kansas had been calling him finished for so long, they almost forgot he could still hear them. The little farmhouse sat 3 miles outside town beyond a dying windbreak of cedar trees, bent sideways by 30 years of prairie wind. The paint had peeled from the porch rails. One shutter hung crooked. The old irrigation pivot in the north field hadn't turned in almost 2 summers. People noticed things like that in western Kansas, especially in towns where survival had become a competition disguised as politeness. And Alan Perry had stopped winning that competition a long time ago. Every morning before sunrise, he drove a faded green pickup into town for coffee at Miller's Diner. Same booth, same thermos, same quiet nod to the waitress named Jolene who stopped charging him for refills after his wife died. Nobody said much to Alan directly, but small towns talk sideways. That's how places like Dry Creek work. Men lowered their voices just enough to pretend they weren't being cruel. Farm will be gone by winter. Heard Prairie State Bank already sent notices. Old Perry should have sold years ago. Man's hanging onto dirt nobody wants. Now sit with that for a moment, because the truth was, everybody wanted Alan Perry's land. They just wanted him weak enough to surrender it cheap. The Perry farm sat directly between 2 proposed industrial water routes, connected to a pipeline development moving west through Kansas cattle country. Most folks in Dry Creek didn't fully understand the legal side of it. They just knew land prices had suddenly started climbing and businessmen wearing polished boots had begun showing up at county meetings. Wade Holloway understood it perfectly. Wade was the president of Prairie State Bank, and men like him had a way of smiling while calculating what your desperation was worth. He was tall, silver-haired, clean-shaven, and always looked like he'd stepped out of an insurance commercial nobody trusted. His son, Connor, was worse. Connor Holloway wore pressed pearl button shirts and expensive watches and talked about farmland the same way gamblers talked about poker chips. To Connor, Dry Creek wasn't a town. It was inventory. And Alan Perry was standing in the middle of inventory Connor wanted badly. The foreclosure warnings had started quietly, 18 months earlier after hospital bills drained nearly everything Alan had saved, trying to keep his wife Linda alive. Chemotherapy, travel to Wichita, medication insurance wouldn't fully cover, a tractor transmission failure during harvest, then drought, then another weak wheat season. Life doesn't usually destroy people all at once out on the prairie. It strips them layer by layer. And by 68, Alan Perry looked like a man weathered down to the bolts. But there was something people misunderstood about him. Quiet and defeated are not the same thing. Alan still worked every day, still repaired machinery for neighboring ranchers when they couldn't afford dealership rates, still rebuilt hydraulic pumps inside the old garage behind his barn, still sharpened his own blades by hand because he refused to buy anything he could fix himself. That garage mattered more than anyone in Dry Creek realized. The building had belonged to Alan's father, Elias Perry. And if you asked older farmers about Elias, you got 2 completely different versions of the same man. Some called him a mechanical genius. Others called him unstable. A few lowered their voices altogether. Perry knew things he should have left alone. Now let me pause here, because every town has one story people stop telling directly. In Dry Creek, that story was Elias Perry. Back in the 70s and early 80s, Elias had operated the best independent machine shop in 3 counties. Farmers drove broken combines from 50 miles away just to let him listen to the engines. Listen, not inspect. That's what made people remember him. Elias could stand beside a tractor with his eyes closed and tell you which bearing was failing just by hearing the vibration through the block. Men trusted him more than dealerships, and banks hated men like that, especially men who didn't borrow money, especially men who kept records, especially men who asked questions. By the end of his life, rumors spread that Elias Perry had gone paranoid, that he'd hidden paperwork, hidden cash, hidden evidence. Nobody knew exactly what. Then the garage fire happened. Half the workshop burned. County investigators blamed faulty wiring, but old ranchers still whispered about seeing unfamiliar trucks parked near the property the night before. A year later, Elias Perry died sitting alone in a folding chair behind the machine shop with grease still on his hands. Heart attack, they said. And after enough time passed, people in Dry Creek reduced him to a joke. That's what towns do sometimes. They simplify complicated men into stories easier to live with. Allen hated that part most. Not the rumors, not the poverty, not even the foreclosure notices. It was hearing people talk about his father like he'd been crazy. Because Allen remembered the truth. He remembered long nights inside the garage when he was 12 years old, handing wrenches across oil-stained concrete floors while winter wind rattled the tin roof overhead. He remembered Elias teaching him to rebuild carburetors before teaching him algebra. He remembered one sentence more than any other. Machines always tell the truth eventually. At the time, Allen thought his father meant engines. Years later, he realized Elias meant people. That understanding sat heavily inside Allen as he backed his pickup toward the barn, carrying the cracked engine block from the estate auction. Rain tapped softly against the windshield. The headlights swept across old equipment sleeping beneath layers of dust. A case tractor missing a wheel, rusting cultivator discs, broken fence posts stacked beside fuel drums. And there, under the yellow barn light, Allen finally shut off the engine. For a long moment he just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, like a man trying to decide whether hope was dangerous. If you're still with me, this is where the story truly begins. Because Allen Perry had not bought that engine block on impulse. He recognized it immediately at the auction yard. Most people saw cracked steel. Allen saw his father's welding pattern. One narrow seam near the center had been repaired decades earlier using a method almost nobody used anymore. Elias Perry's method. That was why Allen panicked when the forklift dropped it. That was why his face changed. Not because the engine block was valuable, but because he believed something had been hidden inside it since before the garage fire. Maybe papers, maybe proof, maybe nothing at all except an old man's unfinished fear. Even Allen didn't fully know, but he knew this. His father had spent the last years of his life terrified someone would come for that land. And now they were. Allen climbed out into the cold rain. His knees cracked from arthritis as he walked to the trailer. He rested one hand on the engine block again. Cold steel. Old grease. 40 years of silence. Then headlights appeared behind him on the county road. Another truck slowing near the farm. Allen narrowed his eyes. The vehicle idled for a moment beside the gate before continuing down the dark Kansas highway, watching. That's when Allen understood something important. He wasn't the only person who remembered that engine block existed. The first thing Allen Perry learned from his father was how to listen, not talk, not argue, listen. Elias Perry believed engines spoke long before they failed. He used to say metal carried memory the same way old men carried regret. Everything leaves a trace. Eventually he would tell young Allen while grease stained the cracks of his knuckles. Problem is, most people quit paying attention. Now let me tell you something important about western Kansas in the 1970s. That country respected men who survived drought, but it feared men who remembered too much. Back then, Dry Creek still had 2 gas stations, 3 cafes, a rail spur, and enough family farms to fill every church pew on Sunday morning. Wheat prices rose and collapsed like tides. Men gambled entire futures on rainfall forecasts. Banks controlled nearly everything. And in the middle of all that stood Elias Perry's machine shop. The garage sat along County Road 12 beside a weather-beaten grain elevator that no longer exists today. Farmers brought him tractors dealerships couldn't fix. Combines other mechanics had already given up on. Elias rarely spoke while he worked. He listened to rod knock, listened to timing chatter, listened to hydraulic cavitation. Sometimes he'd place one hand flat against an engine block, close his eyes, and stand there silently while other men watched, like they were witnessing something halfway between science and religion. Then he'd point to the exact failing part without opening the machine. People remembered that, especially Alan. As a boy, Alan spent more evenings in that garage than inside the farmhouse itself. While other kids played baseball under stadium lights, Alan organized sockets by size and swept welding dust from concrete floors blackened by 30 years of oil. And he loved it. Not because the work was easy, because it made sense. Machines broke for reasons. People usually broke for quieter ones. If you're still with me, this is where the story underneath the story begins. Because Elias Perry slowly became dangerous to powerful men without even realizing it at first. It started with water. Out in western Kansas, water means survival, always has. In dry years, irrigation rights could determine whether one farmer harvested wheat or buried his farm beneath debt. That made water more valuable than land itself. And sometime during the late 70s, Elias began noticing something strange while repairing county equipment and pipeline machinery. Survey markings didn't match official maps. Access roads crossed parcels they legally shouldn't. Boundary stakes moved. Tiny inconsistencies. Nothing dramatic on its own, but mechanics notice patterns other people miss. That's what made Elias different. One winter night during a blizzard in 1978, Alan remembered his father sitting alone at the workbench beneath a hanging yellow lamp surrounded by county maps spread across stained steel. Alan had been 14. Outside, snow hammered the tin roof hard enough to sound like gravel. "What are you looking for?" Alan asked. Elias didn't answer immediately. He kept staring at the maps. Then finally he said something Alan wouldn't understand for another 40 years. Men steal land slowly now, not with guns, with paper. Now sit with that for a moment. Because Elias Perry was not an educated lawyer, not a politician, not some conspiracy-minded drifter. He was simply observant. And observant men become inconvenient when powerful people depend on nobody asking questions. Over the next few years, Elias quietly collected copies of easements, county surveys, irrigation permits, and land transfer records. He stored them everywhere, inside toolboxes, behind wall panels, under floorboards. Alan once found documents hidden inside an old air compressor tank. At the time, it felt almost childish, like treasure hunting. Only later did he understand his father was scared. Truly scared. By 1981, several small farmers around Dry Creek lost sections of land connected to disputed water access corridors. Most people blamed bad luck and unpaid loans. Elias blamed manipulation. He believed Prairie State Bank County officials and private developers had been quietly reshaping land records for years to position future industrial water routes across struggling farms. But nobody wanted to hear that, especially not during the farm crisis years when bankruptcies spread across Kansas like wildfire. Fear changes communities. Men stop asking questions when survival becomes difficult enough. Then came the argument. Old-timers in Dry Creek still remembered it decades later. Elias Perry stood during a county zoning meeting holding rolled survey maps beneath one arm, while Vernon Holloway, Wade Holloway's father, dismissed him in front of half the town. "Maybe you ought to stick to fixing tractors," Vernon reportedly said. People laughed. Not everyone, but enough. That mattered. Alan remembered the drive home afterward more clearly than the meeting itself. Elias never touched the radio, never spoke, only gripped the steering wheel while cold rain dragged across the windshield. Finally, miles outside town, he muttered quietly, "When men laugh before looking, that's usually because they're afraid to look." The garage fire happened 8 months later, Officially, faulty wiring sparked near the welding corner overnight. Unofficially, too many things about it felt wrong. The fire started near Elias's office instead of the equipment bay. Cabinets had been opened beforehand. Certain shelves were untouched while specific records disappeared completely. And strangest of all, one engine block survived almost perfectly intact despite sitting near the hottest part of the fire. The same engine block Alan bought for $15. Back then, Alan hadn't thought much about it. After the fire, life moved fast and brutally. Insurance barely covered repairs. His mother got sick. Bills piled up. Elias grew quieter. Then came the whispers. People started calling him unstable, paranoid, obsessed. Some said he buried money underground. Others claimed he'd hidden evidence proving county corruption. A few crueler voices simply called him crazy. And over time, Dry Creek did what small towns sometimes do best. It rewrote him into something easier to dismiss. That may be the saddest thing about aging in rural America. Not poverty, not hard labor, being turned into a joke before you're even buried. Alan watched it happen slowly. He watched men who once depended on Elias for survival begin rolling their eyes whenever his father spoke. He watched pride harden into isolation, and he watched Elias begin hiding things, especially during the final year before he died. The old mechanic welded constantly during those months, not machinery, odd projects, metal compartments, sealed casings, heavy iron repairs no customer ever collected. One night shortly before his death, Elias called Alan into the garage long after midnight. The overhead heater rattled weakly. Snow pushed against the windows. Elias stood beside a cracked engine block resting on chains, the same one. He looked exhausted, older than Alan had ever seen him. "If they ever come after this land," Elias said quietly, "don't trust what's written first." Alan frowned. "What does that mean?" Elias hesitated. Then he walked over and placed one grease-covered hand against the engine block. Look inside what men were too proud to keep. That was it. No explanation. No dramatic reveal. Just another strange sentence from a tired old mechanic losing faith in the world around him. 3 months later, Elias Perry died alone behind the machine shop. Heart attack, age 64. And the engine block disappeared into storage after the estate sale cleanup. Until Alan saw it again 40 years later, sitting in a pile of scrap metal at the Dry Creek auction yard. Now let me pause here, because memory is a strange thing. Sometimes people don't recognize the moment their entire life turns, not until years later. But Alan Perry recognized this one immediately. That engine block had survived the fire, survived decades, survived being forgotten, and now somebody else had suddenly dragged it back into public view just as Prairie State Bank started pushing harder for his land. That wasn't coincidence. Standing alone inside the barn that night while rain tapped softly against rusted tin roofing, Alan stared at the cracked steel resting on the trailer. Then he noticed something. Near the lower seam, beneath layers of soot and corrosion, sat an old welding mark shaped like a crooked crescent. Elias's signature. Not officially, just a tiny flaw in the way his father angled finishing passes. Alan stepped closer, ran his fingers across the cold iron, and that's when he realized something else. The weld line near the center wasn't factory. It had been sealed shut deliberately. By sunrise the next morning, half of Dry Creek had already turned Alan Perry into entertainment. That's the thing about small towns. News travels faster than weather. Especially humiliating news. By 6:30, Travis Cole's video from the auction yard had already spread across local Facebook groups and ranching pages. The clip showed Alan struggling beside the trailer while the forklift operator lowered the cracked engine block crooked onto old chains. Then came the moment everybody replayed. The steel slipped, dropped hard against the trailer bed. A sharp metallic crack echoed across the yard. Men burst into laughter. Even through the shaky phone video, Alan's reaction looked strange. He lunged forward too quickly for a man his age, almost falling beneath the trailer tire, trying to steady the block before it shifted again. That was the part people mocked most. not the purchase itself. The panic. Old man guarding junk metal like it's gold. Travis added laughing emojis beneath the upload. By breakfast, men at Miller's Diner were replaying the clip between bites of bacon and eggs. Probably thinks there's treasure in it. Heard the Perry family finally lost their minds. Maybe old Elias hid alien technology in there. The laughter rolled through the diner like smoke, and sitting 3 booths away, Alan heard every word. Now, let me pause here for a moment, because humiliation hits differently when it comes from people who once respected your family. That morning, Alan stirred cold coffee without drinking it. The diner windows rattled beneath hard Kansas wind, while gray clouds crawled low across the prairie. Jolene quietly refilled his cup without asking questions. She'd known Alan nearly 30 years, long enough to recognize when silence meant anger. "You okay?" she asked softly. Alan nodded once. "Lie." Jolene glanced toward the men, laughing over Travis's phone video. "Town's cruel when it gets bored." Alan gave the faintest shrug. "No," he murmured. "Town's scared." That answer stayed with her long after he left. Outside, Dry Creek looked exactly like the kind of place developers love buying one piece at a time. A courthouse with fading brick, a hardware store barely surviving against chain retailers, old grain elevators standing like skeletons against flat winter sky. And beneath everything sat tension. Land tension, money tension, the kind of quiet pressure rural America understands instinctively. Because once outside, money arrives. Neighbors stop looking at fields emotionally. They start calculating acreage. Alan drove straight from the diner to Holloway Farm Supply for welding gas. He hated going there, but it was the only place within 40 miles still stocking the cylinders he needed. The bell above the door rang as he entered. Conversation stopped immediately. That happens sometimes in stories like this, not because people are evil, because crowds enjoy witnessing weakness up close. Connor Holloway leaned against the front counter drinking coffee beside Travis Cole. Both smirked the second Alan walked in. "Well, look who survived the scrapyard," Connor said. A few men chuckled. Alan ignored him. He walked toward the welding aisle, slowly boots, scraping old concrete floors stained by decades of fertilizer dust. Travis called after him, "You cut that thing open yet?" More laughter. Alan reached for a cylinder valve without responding. Connor stepped closer. "You know," he said casually, "I'd honestly pay you double what that block's worth just to save you the trouble." Alan finally looked at him, and what startled Connor wasn't anger. It was how calm the old man looked. "Wouldn't help you much," Alan said quietly. Connor grinned. "Help me with what?" Alan held his gaze another second too long, then turned away. "Now sit with that moment." Because men like Connor Holloway are deeply uncomfortable around people who refuse humiliation properly. See, arrogance works best when the target reacts predictably. Begging, shouting, breaking down. Alan Perry did none of those things. And somewhere beneath Connor's polished confidence that unsettled him. Outside the store, wind pushed dust devils across Main Street, while Alan loaded the welding cylinder into his pickup. That's when another voice stopped him. "You planning to open that thing alone?" Alan turned. Hank Mercer stood beside an old white service truck, smoking beneath the faded sign for Holloway Farm Supply. Now Hank was one of those men prairie towns quietly build themselves around. Retired welder, Vietnam veteran, face worn hard by heat, wind, and 50 years of breathing steel dust. He and Alan had known each other since high school. Not close friends exactly, but men who understood each other without unnecessary conversation. Alan hesitated. Maybe. Hank exhaled smoke slowly. "That crack line ain't natural." Alan said nothing. Hank stepped closer. "Forklift dropped it yesterday," he said. Sounded hollow. That got Alan's attention immediately. Hank noticed. "You hear enough steel in your life," Hank continued. "You learn when metal's lying." There it was again. That same old mechanic language Elias Perry used decades earlier. Machines speaking, steel lying. Alan studied Hank carefully. You remember my father's welding work? Hank nodded once. Better than anybody in this county. Silence stretched between them while wind rattled loose sheet metal somewhere down the block. Finally, Hank said quietly, "That block wasn't repaired." Alan narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean?" Hank crushed the cigarette beneath his boot. "I mean somebody sealed it. Now let me tell you something important. Old craftsmen recognize each other's fingerprints even decades later, not literal fingerprints, patterns, angles, methods. Elias Perry had welded differently from other mechanics. Most men repaired cracks directly. Elias reinforced from stress points outward, using curved finishing passes almost impossible to duplicate exactly. Hank recognized that immediately, which meant something else too. Elias hadn't preserved that engine block. He'd hidden something inside it intentionally. For the first time since the auction, Alan felt genuine fear settle into his chest, not hope. Fear, because if Hank noticed the weld patterns, other people might eventually notice too. And suddenly that truck idling outside Alan's property the previous night felt much less accidental. "If you're opening it," Hank said carefully, "don't do it where folks can see." Alan glanced toward Holloway Farm Supply behind them. Connor stood inside the front window watching too closely. Alan nodded slowly. "Tonight," he said. Hank gave another small nod. Then the older welder looked out across Dry Creek's empty winter streets and muttered something almost to himself. "Funny thing about buried secrets," he said. "People stop laughing real fast once they realize the secret ain't dead." That evening, darkness settled hard across western Kansas. Cold rain tapped against the roof of Alan's barn while weak yellow light spilled across old tools hanging beside warped wooden walls. The engine block rested on heavy chains in the center of the concrete floor, silent, massive, waiting. Alan stood staring at it while memories crawled through his mind like ghosts. His father welding alone at midnight, county maps spread across workbenches, the garage fire, the whispers, the humiliation, all of it somehow connected to this one cracked piece of iron. Headlights swept briefly across the barn windows. Hank arrived exactly at 8, carrying a portable plasma cutter and welding mask. Neither man wasted time talking. That's another thing older men understand. Some moments grow heavier if you speak too much before them. Together they rolled the engine block upright using pry bars and chain hoists. Hank crouched beside the center seam, ran rough fingers along the weld, then finally looked up at Alan. "You ready?" Alan stared at the steel for a long moment. "No," he admitted. Then he picked up his father's old welding gloves anyway. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere beyond the prairie. Inside the barn, Hank lowered his welding mask. The plasma cutter hissed alive, and sparks exploded across the darkness. The plasma cutter screamed through steel like an animal fighting to stay alive. Blue sparks burst across the barn darkness, scattering against old oil drums and rusted tractor panels while smoke curled upward into the rafters. Alan Perry stood beside the chain hoist, gripping his father's welding gloves so tightly the leather creaked in his hands. Hank Mercer worked slowly, carefully. That mattered, because old iron becomes unpredictable when heated after decades of stress and corrosion. One wrong cut could fracture the entire block, or destroy whatever might be hidden inside. Outside, rain hammered the tin roof harder now. Thunder rolled low across western Kansas like distant artillery. Inside the barn, neither man spoke much. Some moments don't belong to conversation. They belong to nerve. Now let me pause here for a second, because people watching from the outside often imagine discoveries as dramatic instant revelations. But real discoveries usually arrive inch by inch, through patience, through fear, through silence thick enough to hear your own heartbeat. Hank finished the first pass and shut off the cutter. The sudden quiet rang inside the barn. Steam hissed from cooling metal. Alan stepped closer. The center seam glowed dull orange beneath soot and molten residue. For a long moment, nothing looked different. Then Hank crouched lower. There, he muttered. Alan followed his finger. Behind the outer layer of cast iron sat another plate. Not factory. Hand-fabricated. Welded inward. Alan felt cold move through his chest. Elias Perry had built a compartment, intentionally. Hank looked up slowly. "Your old man didn't repair this thing," he said quietly. "He turned it into a vault." Alan stared at the steel without answering, because suddenly the engine block no longer felt like scrap metal or even evidence. It felt like a message sent across 40 years, and maybe a warning. Hank restarted the plasma cutter, this time more carefully. The second plate separated slower than the first thick welds, resisting every inch. Sparks exploded against Hank's mask while Alan steadied the chains overhead. Then finally, clang, the inner plate broke loose. Something hollow echoed deep inside the engine block. Both men froze immediately. No words, just breathing, rain, cooling steel. Hank removed the welding mask first. "Well," he murmured, "that ain't normal." Alan stepped closer carefully, almost afraid the moment might disappear if he moved too fast. Inside the compartment rested a narrow cylindrical container wrapped in layers of black oilcloth hardened by age. The package looked strangely untouched, protected, preserved. Alan's hands trembled as he reached inside. "Now sit with this moment for a minute, because some objects carry emotional weight beyond explanation." That container had been hidden before Ronald Reagan became president, before Alan married Linda, before his father died, before half the farm surrounding Dry Creek disappeared forever, and somehow it survived all of it. Alan lifted it slowly from the engine block. Heavy, sealed at both ends with brass caps darkened by decades of oil residue. Hank let out a low whistle. "Your father planned this to survive fire." Alan nodded faintly. Or survive being buried. That sentence lingered heavily between them. They carried the container to Elias Perry's old workbench, beneath the hanging yellow lamp still mounted there after all these years. The same lamp, the same bench, the same scar across the wood where Alan accidentally dropped a transmission gear as a teenager in 1972. Memory layered over memory inside that garage. Alan fetched a pipe wrench from the wall. For a second he hesitated, then he stopped completely. "What?" Hank asked. Alan stared at the brass cap. "I keep thinking," he said quietly, "what if he hid this because opening it would hurt somebody?" Hank leaned back against the workbench. "Truth usually does." That answer settled into the room like dust. Finally Alan twisted the wrench. The brass cap resisted hard at first, then suddenly cracked loose. Old air escaped the container with a dry hiss. Alan carefully pulled out the contents, one piece at a time. Oil-wrapped documents. Survey maps rolled tightly with faded red ribbons. Photographs, a small ledger book, and finally a brass key, small enough to fit in the center of Alan's palm. Hank frowned. "Bank box key." Alan nodded slowly. "Looks like it." But neither man focused on the key for long, because sitting beneath everything else rested a folded envelope with one sentence written across the front in faded black ink. "For Alan, if they finally come for the land." The room went completely still. Alan stared at his own name written in his father's handwriting. Not shaky, not frightened, deliberate. Elias Perry knew exactly who would find this, and he knew why. "If you're still with me." This is the moment Alan Perry's life began changing direction. Because up until then, part of him still believed maybe Dry Creek had been right about his father. Maybe grief and isolation had twisted Elias into paranoia during those final years. Maybe the old mechanic really had imagined corruption where none existed. But paranoid old men do not build fireproof steel vaults hidden inside engine blocks containing organized evidence. That requires planning, clarity, purpose. Alan opened the envelope carefully. Inside rested 3 handwritten pages. The first line alone nearly stopped his breathing. "Alan, if you are reading this, then either I was right or the wrong men finally got desperate enough to return." Rain pounded harder outside. Hank quietly stepped away toward the barn doors, giving Alan space. The old mechanic read silently beneath the yellow light, while 40 years of confusion slowly began rearranging themselves inside his mind. Elias described land transfers, water easements, survey manipulations, names, dates. Specific county records altered during the late 70s, and over again one name appeared: Vernon Holloway, Wade Holloway's father, Prairie State Bank. Now let me tell you something dangerous about greed in rural America. It rarely arrives wearing villain clothes. Usually it looks respectable. Pressed shirts, church attendance, handshakes at football games, bank sponsorships at county fairs. That's how powerful men survive for decades in small towns. They wrap exploitation inside respectability. Elias's letter described a quiet effort to control future groundwater corridors long before most local farmers understood the value of industrial water access. According to the document, several struggling families lost land after county survey adjustments quietly shifted easement boundaries beneath legal descriptions almost nobody fully understood. Not outright theft, paper theft. The kind ordinary farmers rarely had money to fight in court, and the Perry land sat directly across one of the most valuable access corridors in the entire county. Alan's stomach tightened. Everything suddenly made sense. The pressure, the foreclosure timing, Connor Holloway's obsession with buying the farm quickly, even the truck outside his property the previous night. Hank eventually returned to the workbench. Well, Alan looked up slowly. My father wasn't crazy. Hank studied him carefully. No, he said softly. Most men called crazy are just early. That line hit Alan harder than expected, because grief changes shape over time. For years, Alan mourned losing his father physically. Tonight, he realized he'd also been mourning something else. His father's reputation, his dignity, his truth. And suddenly the laughter at the auction yard felt different now, smaller, cheap, temporary. Alan unfolded one of the survey maps across the workbench. Even through age stains and fading ink, the markings were obvious to experienced eyes. Original water routes, altered boundaries, handwritten notes. Elias had tracked everything, meticulously. Then Alan noticed something else clipped beneath the final document, a faded photograph. He lifted it carefully. The picture showed 3 men standing beside county survey stakes sometime around 1979. One was Vernon Holloway. Another appeared to be a county official Alan vaguely recognized from childhood. And the third, Alan froze. Hank leaned closer. What is it? Alan stared at the photo in silence, because standing beside Vernon Holloway, smiling into the camera, was a younger version of the man who operated the forklift at the auction yesterday. Alan Perry did not sleep that night. Not really. He sat beneath the yellow workshop lamp while rain faded slowly into silence outside the barn roof, staring at the old photograph spread across Elias Perry's workbench. 3 men, county survey stakes, and standing beside Vernon Holloway smiling into the camera was Earl Daughtry, the same gray-bearded forklift operator from the auction yard. Older now, heavier, but unmistakable. Now let me tell you why that mattered. Because Earl Daughtry had spent the last 30 years pretending to be nothing more than a harmless old equipment handler, drifting between auction salvage yards and county storage lots. Invisible men survive longest in small towns. Nobody watches them carefully. Nobody asks what they remember. But Earl had been there from the beginning. And somehow, after 4 decades, he ended up handling the exact engine block Elias Perry used as a vault. That was no accident. Alan kept turning the photograph beneath the light, while Hank Mercer leaned against the workbench, smoking silently near the half-open barn door. Finally, Hank muttered, "You thinking what I'm thinking?" Alan nodded slowly. Somebody knew that block still mattered. The old welder exhaled smoke into the cold air. Question is whether they were trying to hide it, Hank said quietly, or recover it. That sentence settled heavily inside the garage, because suddenly the auction itself felt wrong, too convenient, too exposed. The engine block hadn't been buried in storage forever. Somebody brought it back out, displayed it publicly, and then watched carefully to see who reacted. If you're still with me, this is where Alan Perry stopped being merely a struggling old farmer and started becoming dangerous, not because he had proof yet, because he finally understood the game being played around him, and understanding changes people, especially men who spent their lives underestimated. The clock above Elias's workbench read 3:17 a.m. when Alan finally unfolded the remaining documents. Survey overlays, water access diagrams, county easement transfers. Most were too technical for ordinary eyes, but Alan had spent 40 years around maps, irrigation routes, and machinery easements. He understood enough immediately to recognize the scale of what Elias uncovered. The Perry farm controlled a narrow underground access corridor connected to the original aquifer routing beneath western Dry Creek County. Not surface water, subsurface access, pipeline access, industrial access, the kind worth millions once corporate expansion arrived. Alan rubbed tired eyes while reading one particular note scrawled in Elias's handwriting. They moved the boundary on paper only. Ground never moved. That line hit like a hammer, because it perfectly explained why Prairie State Bank had pressured him so aggressively to sell before foreclosure proceedings became public. Connor Holloway didn't want the Perry land because it was failing. He wanted it because it was critical. Now sit with that for a minute, because powerful people rarely rush when they can steal slowly. But once they fear exposure, that's when they panic. And panic creates mistakes. Hank eventually pointed toward the brass key still resting beside the documents. What about the box? Alan stared at it silently. Wichita. That was the only word etched faintly into the side, which meant Elias had trusted a bank outside Dry Creek County. Smart man, very smart man. Alan leaned back heavily in the old wooden chair beside the workbench. For the first time in years, exhaustion mixed with something unfamiliar. Purpose, not hope yet. Hope is fragile. This felt harder than hope. It felt like direction. Outside, the storm finally passed. Wind moved softly through dead winter grass beyond the barn, while the eastern horizon slowly began turning pale gray. Morning, another Kansas day beginning. But everything had changed. Now let me pause here, because men Alan's age usually spend their lives shrinking. That's what society expects. Retire quietly, lose relevance slowly, become manageable. But something dangerous happens when older people discover they were lied to for decades. They stop fearing embarrassment. Alan looked again at his father's letter. The final paragraph had been underlined twice. Trust documents, not men who benefit from their disappearance. That sounded exactly like Elias, practical even while afraid. Hank finally crushed out his cigarette and grabbed his coat. What's your move? Alan answered immediately. Wichita. Today, Alan nodded once. No delays. Hank studied him carefully. You planning to tell anybody? Alan looked around the garage. At the opened engine block. The photographs, the maps, the steel vault hidden inside 40 years of silence. Then he shook his head. No, good answer, because by sunrise, Dry Creek was already watching him again. Alan noticed the truck parked near the county road before he even left the property. Dark blue Ford, tinted windows, same vehicle from the night before. It pulled away slowly once his pickup reached the gravel lane, watching again. Alan said nothing, but he noticed. Men like Elias Perry teach their sons to notice patterns, and now patterns were appearing everywhere. The drive to Wichita took nearly 4 hours through flat winter prairie and cattle country, stretching beneath endless gray sky. Alan spent most of it silent. The heater barely worked in the old pickup. Wind whistled through worn door seals. The engine ticked harder than it should, climbing long grades. But Alan trusted old machinery. Old machinery usually warned you before failing completely. People rarely did. Around noon, he arrived at Security Plains Trust, downtown Wichita, carrying the brass key inside his coat pocket. The bank lobby smelled like polished marble and expensive air conditioning. Alan looked painfully out of place. Work boots, oil-stained jacket, weathered hands. That mattered too, because modern institutions often mistake appearance for intelligence. A young banker greeted him politely enough until Alan placed the brass key on the desk. Everything changed after that. The woman disappeared briefly into a back office, returned with a manager, then another employee. Now they looked nervous, respectful nervous. The manager cleared his throat carefully. "Mr. Perry, he said this box has been inactive since 1983. Alan felt his chest tighten. The year after Elias died. The manager continued quietly, but the account instructions were very specific. Access transfers directly to you upon presentation of identification and the original key. Elias planned all of it, every step, even decades ahead. Now sit with that, because fathers and sons often misunderstand each other for entire lifetimes. Yet somehow Elias Perry trusted Alan enough to leave the truth waiting 40 years untouched. The manager led him into the vault room personally. Steel doors, concrete walls, cold fluorescent lighting, and there inside a long metal drawer rested another sealed package. Thicker this time, heavier. Alan opened it slowly at a private table inside the viewing room, and almost immediately understood why Elias hid everything separately. Inside rested copies, duplicates, certified copies, affidavits signed by former county workers, property transfer discrepancies, water corridor evaluations, even audio cassette tapes carefully labeled by date. Evidence, organized evidence, enough evidence to destroy reputations if authenticated. But one item froze Alan completely. A notarized affidavit signed by a former county clerk named Miriam Vance dated August 14, 1982. The statement described direct pressure from Vernon Holloway and county officials to alter land corridor descriptions tied to future industrial water routes, and attached beside it sat a handwritten note from Elias. "If anything happens to me, this is why." Alan lowered the paper slowly. For years he'd buried anger beneath survival, bills, harvests, grief, but now something old and painful finally surfaced fully. His father had not died disgraced. He had been isolated deliberately, discredited deliberately, possibly silenced deliberately, and Dry Creek laughed while it happened. That realization hurt worse than the poverty ever did. If you're still with me, the story is no longer about hidden documents. It's about dignity, about what happens when truth survives longer than the people trying to bury it. Alan sat alone in the vault room for nearly 20 minutes. Then finally he gathered the papers carefully back into the box. His hands no longer trembled. That part was gone now. Fear changes shape once certainty arrives. When he exited the bank, the winter sun hung low across downtown Wichita, and parked half a block away beside a newspaper stand sat the same dark blue Ford truck again, waiting. Alan stared at it through the cold afternoon wind. The driver remained hidden behind tinted glass, watching him. Then the truck pulled away slowly into traffic. Alan never chased it, never waved, never reacted. But as he climbed into his pickup, one thought settled clearly into his mind. Whoever wanted those documents believed he had already found them. Alan Perry returned to Dry Creek after dark, deliberately. He avoided Main Street, avoided Miller's Diner, avoided the glowing windows of Holloway Farm Supply where men gathered every evening pretending gossip was community. The old pickup rolled slowly down frozen county roads beneath a pale Kansas moon, while the cardboard archive box from Wichita sat beside him on the passenger seat, wrapped beneath an army blanket. He kept glancing at it during the drive, not because he feared losing it, because he still couldn't fully believe it existed. 40 years. 40 years his father's truth sat locked underground while Dry Creek buried Elias Perry beneath ridicule. Now let me tell you something painful about reputation. A lie repeated long enough starts feeling inherited. Alan carried part of that inheritance his entire life. Every eye roll when Elias's name surfaced, every joke about paranoia, every whispered comment after the garage fire, and the worst part, Alan himself had doubted pieces of the story eventually. Not fully, but enough. Enough to stop asking questions, enough to survive quietly instead of fighting. That realization hurt him deeply during the long drive home, because somewhere inside the archive box sat proof his father died telling the truth, and Alan had spent decades trying mostly to endure rather than uncover it. The Perry farm appeared out of darkness near midnight. Still, lonely, wind pushing dry grass beneath starlight. Alan parked inside the barn immediately and killed the headlights fast. Instinct. He listened carefully before stepping out. Silence. No engines nearby. No movement. Still, he carried the archive box inside like a hunted man. Hank Mercer was waiting beside the workbench, drinking burnt coffee from a thermos. "You got followed?" he asked immediately. Alan nodded once. "Same truck." Hank's jaw tightened. "That means they know enough to worry." Alan set the archive box down beneath the yellow lamp. "No," he said quietly. "They know enough to panic." That distinction mattered. Panic makes powerful men reckless. If you're still with me. This is where the story shifts from discovery into preparation. Because Alan Perry understood something important now. Evidence alone changes nothing. Not unless somebody survives long enough to use it. Over the next several days, Alan disappeared from public life almost entirely, which only fueled town gossip harder. Connor Holloway noticed first. The younger businessman sat inside Prairie State Bank, reviewing foreclosure projections when Travis Cole walked into his office, carrying another coffee and grinning. "Haven't seen old Perry around much," Travis said. Connor barely looked up, probably embarrassed. But privately, Connor wasn't convinced anymore, not after the auction, not after seeing Alan's expression when the engine block cracked, and definitely not after Earl Daughtry stopped answering phone calls. Now Earl mattered more than Connor admitted publicly, because Earl handled old county storage auctions for years, quietly, reliably, and suddenly, immediately after Alan purchased that engine block, Earl vanished. No calls, no appearances, nothing. That bothered Connor deeply. Meanwhile, Alan and Hank worked inside the garage every night organizing Elias's records. Maps covered the workbench, timeline notes filled legal pads, property transfers connected like spiderwebs across decades. The deeper Alan looked, the uglier the pattern became. Families pressured during drought years, boundary adjustments appearing after refinancing, pipeline corridor access rerouted through distressed farmland, and always somehow Prairie State Bank positioned near the center, not openly criminal. Never that simple, strategic, predatory, calculated. Now let me pause here for a second, because evil in places like Dry Creek rarely looks dramatic. It looks administrative, paperwork, deadlines, legal notices, interest rates. That's how farms disappear in America now, not through violence, through exhaustion. One evening around dusk, Alan drove into town for copies at the public records office. The second he stepped through the courthouse doors, conversation thinned noticeably. People watched him now, differently, not respectfully yet, but cautiously. That happens when mocked people stop looking defeated. Martha Bennett noticed immediately. Now Martha was one of the last independent attorneys still practicing in Dry Creek County. Nearly 70 herself, she carried sharp eyes behind thin reading glasses and spoke with the kind of calm precision that terrified dishonest men. She'd known Alan since high school. More importantly, she remembered Elias Perry before the rumors consumed him. "You look like a man carrying dynamite," she said quietly when Alan entered her office. Alan closed the door behind him, then slowly placed the Wichita archive box on her desk. Martha's expression changed instantly. "What is this truth?" Alan answered. 3 hours later, Martha sat motionless beneath dim office lighting, flipping through affidavits with growing disbelief. At one point, she removed her glasses completely. "My God," she whispered. "I'm married." Alan leaned back silently across from her. Martha looked up slowly. "Do you understand what these documents mean?" "I understand enough." "No," she said carefully. "I don't think you do." She spread several maps across the desk. These easements alone could invalidate portions of the county's industrial water corridor agreements. Alan said nothing. Martha continued, "And if these affidavits authenticate, She paused heavily. Prairie State Bank could face civil exposure stretching back decades. The room fell silent. Outside, courthouse windows rattled beneath hard winter wind. Finally, Martha asked the question hanging over everything. Why didn't your father go public? Alan looked down at Elias's letter resting on the desk. He tried. Martha slowly nodded. Yes, that sounded true. Very true. Now sit with this for a moment, because Alan Perry finally understood the real reason powerful people mocked Elias instead of confronting him directly. Mockery isolates better than threats. Once a man becomes crazy publicly, nobody examines his evidence carefully anymore. That realization changed how Alan viewed his entire town. Not evil people, weak people. People afraid of losing comfort. That's different, and somehow sadder. Over the next week, pressure around the Perry farm intensified noticeably. County tax notices arrived unexpectedly. An inspection complaint targeted one of Alan's fuel tanks. A bank representative appeared asking again whether Alan wished to discuss debt resolution options. Connor Holloway himself eventually visited the farm. That meeting happened on a freezing Thursday afternoon beneath gray Kansas sky. Connor stepped from his polished black truck wearing expensive boots, completely unsuited for mud. Alan watched him approach from beside the garage. No invitation, no handshake. Connor smiled anyway. Alan, he said warmly, thought we should talk neighbor to neighbor. Dangerous sentence. Men usually say neighbor to neighbor right before attempting something dishonest politely. Alan wiped grease from his hands slowly. About what? Connor glanced toward the barn. That engine block mostly. Alan's expression never changed. Connor continued carefully. Earl Daughtry mentioned your father used to store odd things inside equipment sometimes. There it was. Fishing. Alan leaned against the garage doorway. Earl tell you that recently? Connor hesitated, almost invisibly. Tiny mistake. Yes, he said. Lie. Alan saw it immediately. Now let me tell you something satisfying. Old mechanics become excellent at spotting hesitation. Machines teach timing. And liars always mistime something. Connor kept smiling. If there's paperwork connected to the property, he continued, I'd hate for you to misunderstand old documents and create unnecessary trouble. Alan stared at him quietly for several seconds, then finally asked, You nervous, Connor? The younger man blinked. What? Alan stepped closer, not aggressively, calmly. You sound nervous. Connor's smile weakened for the first time. Look, he said, lowering his voice. Whatever your father believed back then. My father knew, Alan interrupted softly. Silence. Cold wind moved through the cedar trees behind the house. Connor studied the old man carefully now. Really carefully. And for the first time since this story began, Connor Holloway realized Alan Perry might not be cornered anymore. That frightened him. Alan saw that too, which is why his next words landed so heavily. You should tell Wade, Alan said quietly, that I finally opened the engine block. Connor's face drained slightly, not much, but enough. Then Alan turned away and walked back into the garage without another word. Leaving Connor standing alone in the winter wind beside the farm his family had spent years trying to swallow quietly. And as Connor climbed back into his truck, one thought settled into his mind. With growing dread, Elias Perry had hidden something far worse than money. The county hearing was scheduled for Tuesday morning. By Monday afternoon, everybody in Dry Creek knew about it. That's how anticipation spreads in rural towns. Not loudly, quietly, through feed stores, coffee counters, gas pumps, church parking lots. Perry finally losing the farm, heard Holloway's pushing foreclosure through. Supposedly, Alan's bringing old paperwork. Probably another Elias Perry ghost story. People laughed, but less confidently now. Now let me tell you something about fear. The moment uncertainty enters a small-town, mockery becomes cautious, and Dry Creek was becoming cautious. Tuesday arrived beneath hard gray Kansas sky and 20-mile-per-hour wind that shoved dust across courthouse steps before sunrise. Pickup trucks lined the square early, Farmers, county workers, curious locals. Even Travis Cole showed up carrying coffee and trying to act amused, despite checking his phone every 30 seconds. Because people sensed something larger than foreclosure was about to happen. Inside the courthouse, fluorescent lights buzzed softly above rows of folding chairs, arranged for the county review board. At the front sat 3 commissioners beneath the county seal, mounted crooked against wood paneling faded by decades of cigarette smoke and bad decisions. Wade Holloway arrived first. Perfect suit, perfect tie, perfect confidence. He moved through the room, shaking hands calmly, like a man attending a fundraiser instead of a legal hearing that might destroy his family's reputation. Connor followed behind him carrying a leather portfolio, but if you watched carefully, really carefully, you noticed Connor scanning the room constantly. Doors, windows, people, nervous men always monitor exits. Martha Bennett noticed too. "You were right," she whispered quietly to Alan from across the hallway before proceedings began. "They're scared." Alan stood beside her holding a weathered metal toolbox in one hand. Not briefcases, not expensive folders, his father's old toolbox. That mattered, because symbolism matters in stories like this, whether people realize it or not. Inside the toolbox sat copies of Elias Perry's documents, the photographs, the affidavits, and resting beneath everything else, a broken piece of the engine block itself. Alan had cut away the welded compartment section carefully. Now the steel carried visible proof the vault existed. If you're still with me, this is the moment the entire emotional weight of the story begins turning. Not because Alan suddenly became powerful, because the people who mocked him were about to lose certainty publicly, and uncertainty humiliates arrogant men faster than defeat itself. The hearing began at 9 sharp. County Commissioner Dale Renner cleared his throat into the microphone. This hearing concerns pending foreclosure review regarding the Perry agricultural property and associated county easement disputes. Dry language, administrative language, that's how life-changing moments often sound at first. Wade Holloway stood smoothly. He spoke first. Of course he did. Men like Wade always prefer controlling the opening narrative. He described delinquent payments, agricultural instability, bank obligations, legal foreclosure pathways, reasonable acquisition opportunities. All very polished, very professional, very clean. And while he spoke, several people in the audience nodded sympathetically, because on the surface, Wade looked responsible. Alan looked like an aging farmer refusing reality. That was the story Dry Creek understood. Then Wade made a mistake, a small one, but devastating. Prairie State Bank has acted in good faith throughout every phase of this process, he said confidently. Alan finally looked up, and Martha Bennett smiled very slightly beside him, because both of them now knew good faith was exactly what the documents would destroy. Connor spoke next. He framed the Perry land as economically distressed and underutilized. He talked about future development opportunities, regional infrastructure, community investment, progress. Now sit with that word for a moment. Progress. Because throughout American history, powerful people have hidden greed inside that word beautifully. Connor finished by saying, "It's unfortunate Mr. Perry inherited certain misunderstandings from his father." There it was, the old strategy. Discredit Elias again, discredit Alan by inheritance. A few people chuckled softly. Travis Cole smirked, and for one brief moment it almost worked. Then Commissioner Renner turned toward Alan. "Mr. Perry," he sighed politely, "do you have anything you'd like entered into the record before proceedings continue?" Silence filled the room. Alan stood slowly. No dramatic anger, no shouting, just an old farmer rising carefully from a folding chair with 40 years of humiliation sitting quietly behind his eyes. He carried the metal toolbox forward and placed it gently on the evidence table. The sound echoed through the room, harder than expected. Clank. Then Alan spoke for the first time. "My father spent the last years of his life being called crazy in this county," he said calmly. The room shifted slightly, not emotionally yet, but attentively. Alan continued, Turns out he was keeping records. Wade Holloway leaned back in his chair, smiling faintly, confident still. That confidence lasted another 90 seconds. Alan opened the toolbox, removed the broken engine block section, and set it directly onto the table. The room frowned collectively. Confusion. Commissioner Renner blinked. What exactly is that? Alan rested one weathered hand on the steel. Evidence. Soft laughter scattered across the room. Connor smirked openly. Even Travis shook his head, but Alan never reacted. That was the difference now. He no longer needed approval from people who mocked before understanding. Martha Bennett stepped forward carrying certified document copies. Mr. Perry recently recovered hidden materials sealed inside this engine compartment by his late father Elias Perry in approximately 1982. That sentence landed like a hammer. Laughter faded immediately. Not gone yet, but wounded. Martha continued laying out documents one by one beneath the fluorescent lights. Survey overlays, affidavits, bank records, county easement discrepancies. The commissioners leaned forward slowly. Wade stopped smiling. Now let me pause here, because truth rarely arrives dramatically in real life. Usually, it arrives piece by piece while powerful people slowly realize the room is no longer under their control. That's exactly what happened. Martha presented Miriam Vance's notarized affidavit first. The former county clerk described direct instructions from Vernon Holloway and county officials to alter agricultural access descriptions tied to future industrial water corridor planning. Commissioner Renner frowned deeply. Connor whispered something urgently toward Wade. Wade ignored him. Bad sign. Very bad sign. Alan remained standing quietly beside the evidence table while Martha continued speaking. Additionally, she said calmly, these original survey records demonstrate that portions of the Perry agricultural property were improperly reassigned through undocumented boundary modifications beginning in 1979. One commissioner adjusted his glasses nervously. Another asked immediately, "Are you suggesting county fraud?" Martha answered without hesitation. "I'm suggesting documented irregularities requiring investigation. Smart lawyer language. Precise. Controlled. Deadly." Then came the photograph, the one from 1979. Martha placed it carefully before the commissioners. This image, she explained, shows Vernon Holloway, alongside county survey personnel, during disputed corridor adjustments later absent from official records. Wade finally spoke sharply. "That proves absolutely nothing. Too fast. Too emotional. Another mistake." Alan looked directly at him for the first time all morning. "My father tried telling people that 40 years ago." The room went silent again, deeply silent now, because suddenly Elias Perry no longer sounded crazy. He sounded early. And that realization spread visibly across faces throughout the courthouse, especially older farmers, men who remembered the garage fire, men who remembered the rumors, men beginning to wonder whether they'd laughed at the wrong person all those years ago. Then Martha delivered the final blow. "The Perry property," she said carefully, "appears to contain critical access positioning connected to current industrial water expansion corridors." Connor's face visibly drained. There it was. The real reason behind everything. Not a worthless farm, not a stubborn old man. Control, money, infrastructure, millions hidden beneath ordinary prairie land. Commissioner Renner removed his glasses slowly. "Mr. Holloway," he asked quietly, "was Prairie State Bank aware of these claims previously?" Wade hesitated. Tiny pause, tiny crack, but everybody saw it, and once powerful men crack publicly, the room changes permanently. "I think," Wade answered carefully, "we need additional review before entertaining accusations." Translation panic. Alan recognized it immediately. So did Martha. So did every older rancher in the audience who spent decades learning how fear sounds beneath polished language. Then something unexpected happened. Earl Daughtry entered the courthouse. The entire room turned. The old forklift operator looked exhausted, pale, and terrified. He removed his cap slowly while staring toward the evidence table. toward the broken engine block, then toward Wade Holloway, and quietly said, "I think I need to tell the truth before I die." No one laughed after that. Not one person. Nobody moved when Earl Daughtry spoke. Not the commissioners, not Wade Holloway, not even Travis Cole with his phone halfway raised beside the back wall. The courthouse felt frozen, like the entire room suddenly understood history had just stepped through the door carrying a shovel. Earl removed his cap slowly and looked older than Alan remembered from the auction yard only days earlier. Not physically older, morally older. There's a difference. Some men age all at once when guilt finally catches up to them. Now let me tell you something about guilt in rural towns. It survives longer than memory. People may forget details, but they remember feelings, and Earl Daughtry walked into that courthouse carrying 40 years of feeling. Commissioner Renner cleared his throat carefully. "Mr. Daughtry," he said cautiously, "are you asking to make a statement for the record?" Earl nodded once. "Yes." Wade Holloway stood immediately. "This is highly irregular." No, Martha Bennett interrupted sharply. "What's irregular is 40 years of manipulated land records. That landed hard. Especially because Martha almost never raised her voice." Wade slowly came back down. But Alan noticed something important then. Connor Holloway looked terrified, not angry. Terrified, because younger men raised around power often believe systems are permanent until they watch them crack publicly for the first time. And the cracks were spreading now. Earl walked slowly toward the front table. Every bootstep echoed. The old man looked at Alan briefly before speaking. "I worked county survey support crews back in '79, he said quietly. Part-time hauling equipment, marking stakes, clearing routes. He swallowed hard. Vernon Holloway paid extra cash off the books. Silence. Deep silence. Earl continued staring at the floor. "At first, I thought it was legal. Didn't ask questions. Most people didn't. Now sit with that, because enormous corruption rarely requires thousands of evil people. It only requires enough ordinary people willing not to ask questions." Earl's hands shook visibly. "We moved boundary stakes," he admitted. "Not far. Sometimes only a few yards, but enough to alter easement positioning once paperwork updated." Commissioner Renner leaned forward. "You're stating county land boundaries were intentionally manipulated." Earl nodded slowly. "Yes." A woman near the back gasped softly. Wade Holloway stood again. "This is nonsense from an old man trying to protect himself." Earl finally looked directly at him. "No," he said quietly. "I already spent 40 years protecting your family." That one sentence changed the room permanently, because suddenly Earl Daughtry no longer looked like a drifting auction worker. He looked like a witness, and witnesses terrify powerful men. If you're still with me, this is the moment Alan Perry stopped standing alone. Earl described everything slowly. Survey crews pressured to adjust markers before official inspections, temporary documents replacing originals, farmers targeted during drought years because financial distress made legal resistance unlikely. Prairie State Bank refinancing properties immediately after disputed boundary reviews. And throughout all of it, Elias Perry noticing patterns nobody else bothered studying. "He figured it out early," Earl admitted quietly. "Did he confront you?" Martha asked. Earl nodded. "Garage office, winter of '81. The old man stared at his hands. "He told me men like us always convince ourselves we're only moving paper until families start disappearing from land." Alan felt something tighten painfully in his chest hearing that, because he could suddenly picture the moment perfectly. Elias Perry standing beneath that yellow garage lamp, grease on his hands, maps spread across steel tables, trying desperately to stop something larger than himself, and nobody listening. Now let me pause here, because there's a particular kind of loneliness attached to telling the truth too early. History celebrates those people later, but during the actual moment communities usually mock them first. That's what happened to Elias Perry, and now Dry Creek was beginning to realize it collectively. Commissioner Renner eventually turned toward Wade Holloway. "Did your father participate in any of these survey adjustments?" Wade's face hardened. "My father is dead," he answered carefully. "That's not what he asked," Martha said. Connor shifted visibly beside him, badly. Alan noticed sweat gathering along Connor's collar despite the cold courthouse air. That mattered too, because guilt often appears physically before it appears verbally. Then Martha delivered the final piece. She placed the audio cassette tapes from the Wichita lockbox onto the evidence table. The entire room stared. "What are those?" Renner asked. "Recorded conversations," Martha answered calmly. "Made by Elias Perry." Connor whispered something urgently toward Wade again. This time Wade looked rattled too, real rattled. Now the room understood something enormous. Elias Perry had not merely suspected corruption, he documented it thoroughly, systematically, and somehow his evidence survived 4 decades hidden inside an engine block nobody respected enough to examine carefully. There's poetry in that, real poetry. The very people who mocked old machinery and old men were ultimately destroyed by both. The hearing recessed briefly while commissioners reviewed preliminary material privately. Outside the courthouse, the entire town buzzed like disturbed hornets. Farmers stood in clusters beneath the gray Kansas sky, speaking in low voices. People replayed memories suddenly differently. Old land disputes, bank foreclosures, rumors, deaths. Everything looked different once the first lie collapsed. Travis Cole stood near the courthouse steps staring at Alan uncertainly. The young mechanic looked smaller somehow, less loud. That happens when arrogance collides with consequence. Eventually Travis approached awkwardly. "I didn't know," he muttered. Alan studied him quietly. Travis glanced down. "About your dad, I mean." Alan nodded once. "I know, no anger, no revenge speech." That unsettled Travis more than yelling would have, because quiet dignity forces people to confront themselves honestly. Meanwhile, inside the courthouse, panic spread behind closed doors. Connor Holloway argued fiercely with Wade. "We should settle," Connor hissed. Wade looked furious. "Settle with what?" 40 years of allegations. Connor lowered his voice further. "If those tapes verify, they won't." But Wade no longer sounded certain. That was the difference. Confidence had carried the Holloways for decades. Now uncertainty entered the room, and uncertainty corrodes power fast. By late afternoon, the commissioners reconvened publicly. Commissioner Renner looked exhausted, older somehow. "We are formally suspending all foreclosure proceedings regarding the Perry property, pending a full independent review." The courthouse erupted instantly. Gasps, shouting, whispers, reporters from Wichita already arriving near the back wall. Then came the second announcement. "A state-level investigative request will be filed regarding historical easement alterations connected to Prairie State Bank and associated county records." Connor closed his eyes completely. Finished. He knew it already. The pipeline developers would run immediately. Banks survive risk by abandoning damaged people quickly, and the Holloways were now damaged publicly. Now sit with this moment, because Alan Perry spent years being viewed as the weakest man in Dry Creek. Widowed, in debt, mocked, quiet, but by the end of that afternoon he was the only person in the courthouse standing completely calm. That's earned victory, not sudden power, not fantasy revenge. Truth surviving long enough to stand upright publicly. Wade Holloway approached Alan outside the courthouse after adjournment. The winter sun hung low across Main Street while wind carried dust between parked trucks. Wade looked older too now, smaller somehow. That happens when reputation fractures. "You could destroy this town with this," Wade said quietly. Alan stared at him. "No," he answered softly. "Your family did that already." Wade looked away first. Another small thing, but meaningful, because powerful men almost never look away voluntarily. Then Alan added something even harder. "My father tried warning people." Wade said nothing. What could he say? That Elias Perry was right, that decades of ridicule protected corruption, that an old mechanic understood honor better than bankers did. Some truths arrive too late for apologies. If you're still with me, understand this. Alan Perry never wanted revenge. Not really. He wanted his father returned to the truth. And that happened the moment Dry Creek stopped laughing at the name Elias Perry. That night, Allen drove home beneath fading orange Kansas sky, while radio stations across western counties began reporting the investigation. The old pickup rattled. The heater barely worked. The farm was still struggling. Bills still existed. Nothing magically transformed overnight. But emotionally, everything changed. Because for the first time since Elias Perry died, Allen no longer carried inherited shame, only inherited truth. And waiting for him inside the old garage sat the cracked engine block that survived fire, silence, mockery, and 40 years underground long enough to finally speak. Spring came late to Dry Creek that year. Cold mornings lingered longer than usual across western Kansas, and frost still clung stubbornly to fence posts well into April. But eventually the prairie softened. Winter wheat greened. Cattle moved slower beneath warmer wind. And little by little, the town that once laughed at Allen Perry began driving past his farm differently. Not faster, slower, looking. Now let me tell you something about truth. Real truth doesn't explode all at once. It settles into a community gradually like rainwater sinking through dry ground. And once it settles, nothing grows the same afterward. The state investigation widened through spring and summer. Prairie State Bank lost contracts first, then investors, then protection. Several former county officials quietly retired before subpoenas arrived. Pipeline negotiations froze indefinitely, while legal reviews spread across 3 counties connected to disputed easements. Connor Holloway left Dry Creek before harvest. No goodbye, no public statement. Just a moving truck before dawn and a locked office downtown by noon. Wade stayed. Older men usually do. Pride roots deeper than practicality after a certain age. But the banker no longer walked into Miller's diner smiling. No more easy handshakes. No more confident laughter at county meetings. He carried silence now, the same silence Allen Perry once carried alone. There's justice in that too. Not cruelty. Balance. If you're still with me, understand this part carefully. Allen Perry never became rich from the documents. That's not the kind of story this is. He received settlement offers eventually, yes, large ones. Corporate firms approached quietly hoping to purchase rights before lawsuits expanded further. Lawyers suggested massive civil claims. Reporters drove out from Wichita trying to interview him beside the old garage. Allen refused nearly all of it, because the older Allen got, the less interested he became in revenge, disguised as opportunity. What he wanted back was never money. It was dignity. And somehow, he already had it now. That summer, he used part of the settlement funds for only one major thing. He rebuilt Elias Perry's garage. Not modernized. Rebuilt, that mattered. The old tin roof got replaced first, then wiring, then insulation. Allen restored the original workbenches instead of buying shiny new steel ones. He rehung Elias's old tool racks exactly where they'd stood before the fire. Even the yellow overhead lamp stayed. Especially the lamp. Hank Mercer helped nearly every day. The 2 old men worked slowly through long Kansas evenings, while swallows nested above the rafters, and local farmers occasionally stopped by pretending they just happened to be driving past. People always find excuses when guilt makes direct apologies difficult. One afternoon, Travis Cole appeared carrying a broken hydraulic pump in both hands. Awkward, nervous, 25 years old, and suddenly aware how foolish he'd been. Allen looked up from the workbench. Travis swallowed hard. Heard you might know how to rebuild these cheaper than dealerships. Now sit with that moment for a minute, because pride matures painfully, especially in young men raised to mistake mockery for intelligence. Allen wiped his hands slowly. Set it down, he said. No lecture, no humiliation. That affected Travis more deeply than anger ever could have. Over time, others came too. Small ranchers struggling with repair bills, young mechanics unable to afford technical school, widowers, farm kids, men whose fathers never taught them anything except how to borrow money. Alan helped them quietly, sometimes for almost nothing, sometimes free, not charity, instruction. There's a difference. And soon the old garage became something Dry Creek hadn't seen in years. A place where people repaired things instead of replacing them immediately. Machines, trust, pride, even themselves. The sign outside changed that fall. Perry Repair Cooperative, simple black lettering, nothing flashy. But every truck that pulled into the gravel lot carried respect with it now, and resting inside the center of the workshop beneath mounted lights sat the cracked engine block. Alan placed it there personally. Cut open, weld seams visible, the hidden compartment exposed forever. People stared at it constantly, especially visitors hearing the story for the first time. One afternoon, a teenager asked Alan why he kept it instead of selling it to a museum. Alan looked at the old steel quietly before answering. Because people need reminders, he said, of what Alan rested one hand against the iron. That valuable things sometimes get mistaken for junk. Now let me pause here, because that sentence was never really about machinery. It was about Elias Perry, about Alan himself, about every quiet person communities underestimate because wisdom rarely advertises loudly. Years passed, not dramatically, honestly, the best kind of ending. Wheat seasons came and went, some good, some terrible. That's farming. But the Perry land survived. More importantly, so did the truth underneath it. Eventually, the state findings officially confirmed historical county irregularities tied to agricultural easement manipulation during the late 70s and early 80s. No criminal charges reached Wade Holloway directly due to time and missing records. But public reputation works differently than courtrooms. Dry Creek knew. And once towns know something deeply enough, official paperwork barely matters anymore. Wade Holloway retired quietly 2 years later. No celebration, no speeches, just absence. Meanwhile, the garage grew busier every season. One wall became covered with photographs of repaired tractors and local families who couldn't have survived harvest without help. Another wall displayed old tools from Elias Perry's original shop, and beside the engine block sat a framed, handwritten note beneath glass. Elias Perry's final letter. Alan added only one sentence beneath it. He told the truth. That was enough. If you're still with me, there's one final moment you should hear. It happened nearly 6 years after the courthouse hearing. Late evening, harvest season, golden Kansas sunlight pouring through the garage doors, while dust drifted through the air like smoke. Alan sat alone at the old workbench reading through Elias's original notebook again while younger mechanics cleaned tools nearby. Travis Cole among them now. Funny how life turns sometimes. The young man who once mocked Alan online had become one of the best repair apprentices in the county. Respect changes people when they earn it, honestly. One of the younger boys asked Alan suddenly, "Did you ever hate your father for all this?" The garage quieted. Alan leaned back slowly in the chair, thought about it carefully, then nodded once. For a while, he admitted, the younger mechanics looked surprised. Alan stared toward the engine block resting beneath the lights. "When you're young," he said softly, "you think strong people should protect themselves better." Silence. Then he added, "But eventually you realize some people spend their whole lives protecting everybody else instead." No one spoke after that. Outside Kansas, wind moved softly through wheat fields. Elias Perry once feared losing forever, and inside the old garage, the hidden truth buried inside broken iron continued doing exactly what Elias hoped it someday would. Not destroy people, reveal them. Afterward, some people spend their entire lives being underestimated because they don't speak loudly enough for the world to notice them early. But quiet people often see things others miss. That was the real story of Alan Perry and his father. Not money, not land, not revenge. It was about dignity surviving long enough to be understood. Elias Perry died carrying the weight of a truth nobody wanted to hear. Alan Perry spent decades carrying the shame that truth left behind. And in the end, what restored both men wasn't anger or power, it was persistence. A cracked engine block the world called junk became proof that truth can survive fire, ridicule, time, and silence if someone is stubborn enough to protect it. Maybe that's why stories like this matter, because most people watching have known what it feels like to be dismissed, mocked, ignored, misunderstood, and maybe you've learned too that the loudest people in the room are not always the wisest ones. If this story stayed with you, let us know where you're watching from and what part hit you the hardest. And if you believe quiet strength still matters in this world, subscribe and stay with us for the next story.